Anyway, for those of you who have been following, cannabis has been legalized in Canada. Some of you may be happy about this. Some of you may be annoyed by the smells around the courthouses all these days. This hour is 22 minutes. Did a great video. It's not working, so. But suffice it to say, if you get a chance, it's good Canadian content. And what we are learning is the new test is a spit test, and this hour is 22 minutes. Has a lot of fun with that. What are the limits? So when your client comes in, and I mean this is very relevant to criminal lawyers, we'll all see this, but everyone else, you're going to have your family law client who gets nipped at the side of the road. You're going to have your civil client, the real estate client whose kids go out and get into trouble. These are going to be the questions you're going to just be asked at parties as the year comes on. The laws regarding the limits are coming in December 22nd, I believe it is. So just in time for Christmas and for the Christmas to New Year rush where all the ride programs are out, these are now going to be in effect. So alcohol we all are familiar with. We drink, we get drunk, we take time, we sober up. We have legal limits because we know that virtually everybody is impaired at a certain level. We don't have the scientific or empirical evidence to support this, but they really wanted to come up with a per se limit. So they looked to the states. And what they did is they picked out some numbers that different US states have. The specific one is 5 nanograms per milliliter of blood. Now I can tell you scientifically, based on your weight, how much alcohol you're going to have to drink to get to a level to be over the legal limit. For cannabis, I have no clue. And because I have no clue, I can guarantee you don't, even though you might think you do. So when in doubt, just say you can't drive. There is also a criminal offense, a hybrid offense. If you were at 2.5 nanograms per milliliter plus 50 milligrams of alcohol per 100 milliliters of blood, again, don't mix marijuana and alcohol because you will not be able to figure out what level you're at. And unlike my breathalyzer that I can buy for $150 and carry around in my car to parties, I don't have one yet for marijuana. I tried to buy one, they won't sell them. They're just too busy. As well though, marijuana's been legalized, so we've all been focusing on marijuana. But marijuana is not the only one that they've set a limit for. They've also set a limit for GHB at 5 milligrams per 100 milliliters. And the reason that they didn't set that one at 0 is some scientists pointed out that everyone has GHB in their system. It's a naturally occurring chemical in our body. So what they determined was we really shouldn't criminalize everybody. So they set a limit that they think people aren't going to reach. Then we have 0 limits. These are important as well because some of these are things that people like to play with. LSD, so acid for some of the older people. I don't seem to see young people doing them anymore. Magic mushrooms, so psilocybin and psilocybin. PCP, ketamine, cocaine, methamphetamine, and there's a specific metabolite to heroin, so they're not going to catch all opioids, but they are going to catch anybody who uses heroin at all. So stay away from those drugs. That's why. Remember as well, there is now going to be a straight summary offense for THC. The interesting part of this is that for those of you who practice or remember first year criminal law summary offenses versus indictable offenses, for lawyers, we're going to probably, I imagine the Law Society is going to have some strange questions for us if we're convicted of even a summary offense. And 2 nanograms per milliliter is not that much. We'll get into a little bit about the problems with THC elimination in a bit. Here we go. So, no one really knows how much is too much. Individual tolerance changes just like with, to a certain degree with alcohol based on weight, but it's a non-linear elimination rate. And the level that you're at doesn't necessarily match impairment. So when one smokes marijuana or imbibes in another way, you immediately get a blood concentration that shoots up because it goes into the blood. You then absorb it because THC is a fat soluble as opposed to a water soluble. It doesn't go into your muscle tissue, it goes into your fat tissue and you absorb that all in, and that's where you hit that first low point. Then that's really where it's starting to impair you, though you may or may not be over a legal limit. Then as it seeps out of the fat into the blood, crosses the blood-brain barrier and starts to affect you, you start to see your level climb back up. Again, you're impaired. Then you taper off again. So your level immediately after smoking will be very, very high, but you won't be impaired. Your level then may be very impaired, but not over the legal limit. Then you might be both, then you might be neither. Needless to say, the science is complicated and it's not easy to determine. So how do we figure out whether or not you're over the limit? So far, the federal government has approved one approved screening device for roadside use. This is basically what it is. Spit in the tube at the right temperature, at the right angle, only get saliva, make sure there's no blood or food or drink or anything else there. And it costs about $8 a time to use one of these things. So unlike breath testing, where the officers can just test everybody, at $8 a pop, the officers are going to be limited through some financial constraints to probably not use this just randomly the way that they use the breathalyzer. Oh, also, breathalyzers are now mandatory. They do not have to have grounds as of the new amendments in December either. So if you get pulled over and they say blow in this machine, don't ask them for their grounds, don't challenge them, just blow in the damn thing. Don't ruin your Christmas. Basically, this works a lot like a pregnancy test. It takes the saliva instead of the urine, but it basically goes down the tube, through, and it interacts with a chemical inside. You then put it in your Keurig machine, and it makes a lovely cup of coffee. No. So this is the actual machine. The magic actually happens in the little sampling cartridge. Basically what this does is it sets it at the right level, warms it to the right temperature, keeps it there, and then it reads off the bars. And just like your pregnancy test where there's a line, but if it's a plus then you're positive and you're pregnant, this basically has a set of different lines. It reads the lines, and instead of being pregnant, you have a drug in your system. It's a 12% false positive rate. So that means that 12 out of 100, 6 out of 50, 3 out of 25, I'm trying to break it down, all of a sudden those are people who test positive even though they are not positive. So that is your innocent client having to then go back and give a blood sample. False negatives are scary too, because that means we're missing people. And those are another about 7%. So 7% of people are guilty but get let go. And those are scary to me because I'm not driving impaired and I'd like everyone else to not be too. Again, the proper temperature and angle, the warm-up period, the fact that it takes about 10 to 12 minutes to actually do the test, and it really only provides a pass-fail reading. So what do we do with that? Well, we have to look at the fact that unlike breath, which is very unintrusive and quick, and the detention at the side of the road is short, you're going to have more and more people stop for longer periods of time for a more intrusive testing that is less reliable, that will then lead instead to another breath test, leads to a blood test. Because the only way we can be sure what your level is to take blood. The alternative, if they don't have the machine, because these machines cost about $12,000 retail, and again, we're not going to see them imposed everywhere because you're going to have them in a cruiser that's been running at the right temperature, at the right angle. So you're not going to have it out in a lot of country OPP jurisdictions. The alternative is the standardized field sobriety test. So those are three things. The first is the one we've all seen on TV, which is follow with your eyes. And what they're looking for is the jerking of your eyes. It has to be a distinct and sustained nystagmus, so for 4 seconds your eyes have to be flickering. Anybody who wants to see what this looks like, basically spin somebody around for about 4 or 5 times, stop them and have them try to focus on you, and you'll notice their eyes flicking back. That's called rotational nystagmus. It's the exact same concept, it's just that you're inducing it by spinning them around rather than by having a drug. What's interesting is horizontal gaze nystagmus, the following the pen test, doesn't actually show at all for cannabis. Cannabis doesn't induce that. So if a roadside officer says, well, I noticed his eyes were flickering about, well, then it's not cannabis, or they're lying. The next is the walk the line test. Seemingly very simple. Heel to toe, 9 heel to toe steps back, keeping your foot on the line, turn on the line. Make sure you follow the instructions because most people try to do a military style turn. That's a fail. Some people miss, some people step off the line. These are designed to fail. Okay, they are designed to detect impairment. Did I miss? Did I, shoot my foot back? Did I lift my hands more than 4 inches from the side? Any of those things are fails. So for those of us with old rugby injuries, well, I'm not going to do so well. That is the downside to them. They're subjective. They are not for all drugs. They do not tell if you're over a limit or not. And there are weight and age restrictions. If you're over the age of 65 or more than 50 pounds overweight, they have not been scientifically validated. I'm 48 pounds overweight. Okay, so it's not like, 50 pounds after a good meal. I'm pretty close. The one leg stand, simply put, hands at the side, lift your foot 12 inches off, point your toe down, and hold it there for a 30-second count. So, the first 10 seconds are easy, the next 20 are okay, the last 10 are a bitch. What happens next? If you fail the standardized field sobriety test, they will take you back to the police station for the drug recognition exercises. The chief superintendent of the RCMP said last night, the DREs are, quote, not there yet, quote, we don't have a good test right now, end quote. So the question is, how many trials is he going to be subpoenaed at to give that testimony as an expert? Again, the tests work best when people are trained and experienced in these. They first interview you. This is where it's very important, and we'll go over the call in the middle of the night, but this is where it's important to stress to your clients, shut up. Don't say anything. It's part of the testing, but it's part of the testing that you need not answer. The easiest way to tell what drug is affecting a person is to ask them. What drug have you taken? I smoke marijuana. Okay. At that point, usually they won't do it right there on the screen, but they will call marijuana at the end. Whether or not marijuana is ever found in your system, they will usually call it because it's the easiest way, and people are stupid and they don't exercise their rights. They will also ask other things about your health, when you last took your drugs, and we have to also remember, how many people here are on a prescription medication of some sort? I'm on 3, I think. Okay? None of them are impairing, I hope. But anybody ever taken cough syrup? Okay? All of these things are legal drugs. It is illegal to operate a motor vehicle if you're impaired by them. So it doesn't matter if this is cocaine or one of those, that's different. For these tests, if any of those things are found in your urine, then there is a presumption, as of December, if they called that as the class of drug that you were impaired by and they find it in your urine, there is a presumption at law that you were impaired when you were operating the motor vehicle. So how do they know what drug is in your system? They ask you. You very innocently say, well, I took some cough medicine last night. They put down that you're on a central nervous system depressant. All of a sudden you pee in the cup, there's cough medicine in there. You are now presumed guilty. So work backwards from there. Second step after the interview is pulse, first pulse rate, pupil size, an initial estimate of how big your pupils are. They're looking to see whether or not you have a head injury. If your pupils are more than 0.5 millimeter different, then they are going to suggest that you may have a head injury. They'll then do the HGN, which we already talked about. They'll then do a vertical gaze nystagmus, where they're basically having you hold your head steady and see if your eyes move up and whether they flicker up and down. They will then see if you can cross your eyes. 80% of people can cross their eyes, 20% cannot. If you're in the 20% who cannot, you will always indicate for certain drugs. Cannabis, there's a matrix that we'll get to, but basically cannabis expects you to be either off or normal for all things except for lack of convergence and, sorry, I should know this off the top of my head, lack of convergence, blood pressure, and pulse rate. So if you can't cross your eyes, that really leaves them with your blood pressure and your pulse rate. If I'm getting arrested and taken back to the station and being required to perform these tests, my pulse rate is going to be through the bloody roof. And on a good day, is my blood pressure going to be 120/80? No. If I ate today, it's going to be higher than that. I just have a high blood pressure. So I will be impaired by cannabis virtually every time. They then do the divided attention tests. These are the psychophysical tests, which is Close your eyes, touch your nose. Left, right, right, left. Always the same. These are standardized. So when you're defending them down the road, you will know all of these things, and you will have read all of the tests. The walk the line, Romberg balance. Close your eyes, tilt your head back, and do you move at all? You're required to stay stock still. They don't tell you that that's what they're looking for, but that's the issue. If you move by more than a half an inch in any way, that is an indicator that you are impaired to operate a motor vehicle. There we go. Romberg balance, walk and turn one leg, finger to nose, another pulse, another blood pressure, body temperature, and pupil size. In the room light, they take you into a dark room and put a flashlight and then direct light. They will continue. They'll look at your nose and your mouth. They'll check your muscle tone. They'll look for injection sites. They'll do another pulse. Then they interrogate you, which is different than interview you. Basically, it's a little bit meaner. They will then form an opinion, and if they believe that you are impaired by any drug, they will require a toxicological sample. That usually means urine in the province of Ontario, because we just don't have any officers who are phlebotomists who can take blood. Will this one work? This lovely video of a blood draw. For anybody who's squeamish, this is exactly where, when you're doing a trial and you've got a jury or a judge who's a little bit squeamish, actually showing somebody getting stabbed with the needle and pulling the blood out really awakens them to the intrusion on your client's liberty. Saying they took blood sounds, oh, that doesn't matter. Watching it and showing it really brings home the intrusion. So the call in the middle of the night. So the first question you want to ask the officer before you get anywhere is your client under arrest for impaired driving or being over the limit, the per se? Because your advice may be different. If they're arrested for impaired, they're going to have to go through the DREs. If they're arrested for per se, they're going to have to give blood. So for you to be able to advise your client what to do or what not to do, you need to know what their jeopardy is and what they are required to do. Is a bodily sample going to be taken? How and by whom? Am I going to have to tell my client to pee in a cup, to give blood, to let them take the blood? Is it something where they're only going to be taking saliva because they have one of the new machines? Who knows? But you better know so that you can advise the client. Next is the hard one. Assess your client's ability to take instruction. We're presuming they're impaired. That's what they're under arrest for. So how do I tell somebody who's impaired, who's drunk, who doesn't have the wherewithal to be able to operate a motor vehicle, how do I now advise them about their rights that, God willing, they learned in grade 10 civics and they remember? Encourage them to ask the officer at each step, do I have to do this? Do I have to do this? What drugs have you taken? Do I have to answer? If the officer says yes, it's a compelled question. If the officer says no, God willing, your client will keep their mouth shut. But asking questions is something that no police officer, especially a DRE officer, should ever have a problem with. Repeat and ensure that the client knows to answer no questions during, before, or after the DRE or other testing. They will say, you have a right to remain silent. Then they'll say, I demand that you comply with the tests we're about to do. Then they'll say, what drugs are you on? That sounds to me like it's part of the test, even though it's not. So you need to be able to explain that to your impaired client. The questions in the DRE are not part of the test or mandatory, especially about drug usage. Also, encourage them to call you back if they're uncertain about a test. If you're not a criminal practitioner, have somebody you know that you can refer them to that usually answers the phone at night, and if they tell them that if they don't get an answer, call you back. Don't leave your client to duty counsel. They provide useful service, but in specialized areas like this, they provide poor service often. Tell them to listen carefully and watch carefully. The difference, as I say, between getting to the end of your walk and turning, or getting to the end of your walk and turning with small little steps, is the difference between passing and failing. Listening to the officer who tells you, don't start till I tell you to, is the difference between passing and failing. Listening is important, and many of our clients, criminal or not, don't listen on the best of days. When they're under arrest and being tested, you have to make them listen. And seek other counsel's advice. If this isn't your area of expertise, call someone else. That's my book, out available through Irwin Law. I've been bugging all the librarians here to make sure that they have it. And that's basically the presentation. Does anybody have questions about this? Does anybody want to go through a testing?
I do not.
Betty?
Yesterday, we actually have a drug driving program. The officer indicated that the tests were actually $28 as opposed to your $8. Wow. Just.
Well, they're getting screwed.
Okay, no, I just wanted to.
Tell them I've got a place that'll sell it to them for $8, and we'll keep the 20. Fund the Law Association.
So I just wanted to, and part of that was they may, because the cost is so high, they will probably do.
Yeah, they'll stick with the standardized field sobriety testing because it's easier to say that you couldn't follow a pen than to actually test you.
Thank you. I think they're squashed in up here. Thank you.
Just a quick comment about the comment you made about the kids in grade 10 through civics.
Yep.
I don't think they learn that. And I honestly think that our criminal lawyers need to maybe do more in reaching out to our high school students, because I think just seeing what I've seen in the paper in the last 2 weeks, those kids that are up to maybe 22 years old, they don't know the rights.
Yeah. You mentioned an interesting point there too, just that you reminded me that those legal limits, those work for adults.
Yeah, not kids.
For kids, if you're under the age of 22, the legal limit is 0 for THC, just like alcohol. If you're a commercial driver, the limit is 0. So all of these things, I've gone through the criminal limitations, but everybody needs to recall that there are also other limitations for novice drivers that are going to be imposed from a provincial scheme that is going to be vastly different. We're starting out. We don't know where we're going to end up in this.
Nathan, you have the right to remain silent. You have the right not to do the test.
No.
Why?
Because
people might not have heard.
Yeah, so Renee was just asking whether or not you can refuse the test. Just like you can't refuse a breath test, you can't refuse these tests. I suppose you could, theoretically. You will be charged with refusing to comply with the tests, and you will end up with a slightly worse case than if you had just done them. Because I can take these apart fairly well at a trial. The refusal of, usually in very flowery language, no, does not come off well. And so your client will be convicted of the refusal, which is the worst one.
Sorry, Dave, did I? Oh, I never needed a microphone.
I think it's for the recording.
Oh, all right. I might have missed it. I had to step out for a phone call, but I wonder if you can comment on, given the different sources of marijuana and other drugs, I wonder if you can comment on the varying grades and potencies within different strains of marijuana and different growing techniques. So if I buy from Cannabis Canada versus the guy on the street, I'm not necessarily getting the same product, so they're not necessarily going to have the same strength.
So you're running into two different problems there. Number one, if you buy in the street, you don't know what's going to be in it, so there may be other drugs. The other issue is going to be, of course, that marijuana back in the 1970s and early 80s, people were smoking everything. The leaf, the plant, the stem, people just smoked everything. Then in the 80s and 90s, people started realizing, we'll just smoke the leaf and the bud. And then people realized if we grow it right, we can get more. The analogy is this. In the 70s and 80s, the marijuana people were smoking was the equivalent of de-alcoholized beer. In the 80s and 90s, they started drinking wine, and now we're getting into the hard liquor. So what you buy, depending on its strength and potency, is going to affect you the difference between drinking a bunch of de-alcoholized beer or drinking hard liquor.
So your clients can't even know when they purchase or when they're consuming whether an ounce of this versus half an ounce of that are equal to each other?
No, you can, if you buy online on the cannabis store, they do have some of the THC and CBD percentages on it, but if you're growing at home, no, it's like doing home brew.
Okay, and if you'll indulge me, one more question.
Well, could you ask afterwards? Because honestly, I'm being cued by Jay, who's very good about keeping us on time. Eldon let you all know that earlier, and I'm being cued that we need to move on. But thank you very much, Nathan.
Thanks, Terry.
And I'm sure your question and many other questions are to be had. Nathan's going to be around. Please approach him. He's a very friendly guy. Thank you.